We all heard that Bach could improvise a six-voice fugue, that Mozart wrote the overture of the Don Giovanni in one night, and that Beethoven composed his Ninth Symphony when he was already deaf. In any field, we are constantly exposed to the stories of outstanding achievements obtained in a seemingly effortless way by extremely skilled and well-trained individuals. So often, in fact, that it's easy to get frustrated and discouraged. In this episode, I want to tell you quite the opposite story, that of a beginner who struggled for weeks to obtain a very modest result. Last month, I decided to work on short pieces, limiting myself to 2 voices on one instrument, the piano. While on one hand it's simpler than my previous orchestral attempts, on the other hand there's no forgiveness for mistakes. They will be heard loud and clear. Having such a limited set of tools, the piece must be coherent and function on its own. It truly forces you to develop the musical idea in its most essential form and to make sure the overall structure of the composition makes sense. So let's get started. I'm starting here because this is the moment when I decided to transcribe the work-in-progress piece into MuseScore. This will make it easier to compare different versions. At this point I had already spent several days on this piece, with multiple iterations of small developments. I was quite frustrated because the first part didn't sound right and I couldn't find a convincing way to continue the piece. In any case, transcribing it gave me a deeper understanding of the structure I was working with. As you can see, the piece has 2 sections. Let's call them 1 and 2. Section 1 starts with a 2-phrase period, A plus B. It is then repeated, with A staying the same and B appearing in a variation. This whole unit is repeated once more, ending in another variation of B, which also acts as a bridge with section 2. This second section can also be easily divided into 2 parts, which we will call C and D. This overview has been useful because I have initially planned to write a musical miniature that doesn't follow a specific form. However, looking at it this way, it seems to suggest that proceeding with a symmetrical structure might be a good choice. Furthermore, I noticed some of the reasons that might cause the piece to not work well. Let's take a closer look. The first period is made of 2 5-measure long phrases. The second instance of B, however, is 7 measures long, and the third one is 9 measures long. I thought that this lack of symmetry is the cause of some of the issues with this section. We might subconsciously notice these asymmetries and be confused by them, even if we are not counting the measures as we are listening to the piece. Therefore, I tried to change the structure from this to this, giving each variation of B the length of 8 measures. Fixing B2 was quite easy. I noticed one measure didn't contribute anything harmonically and was not particularly interesting melodically either, so I simply decided to remove it. Let's hear the difference. Fixing B1 was more challenging. I knew I had to add one measure, and that the resulting phrase should lead back to the initial motive in A minor. I ended up writing several slightly different variations, and I'm still not entirely satisfied with the result. The first one seemed to work at the piano, probably with some pedal and a free tempo. But put into context, it was a complete disaster. The harmony doesn't follow any direction and the punctuation leading us back to the initial motive is very weak. So I discarded it. Let's move to the next one. I kind of like this version, but eventually I decided to discard it for the same reason that makes me like it. The new pattern adds too much novelty which is not repeated elsewhere. If we listen to the whole piece with this version of the phrase, the imbalance between novelty and repetition is quite evident. My hypothesis is that this choice would introduce an expectation in the listener that would remain unmet, therefore making the whole piece less coherent. Furthermore, the punctuation at the end would probably also need some improvement. For the next version, I kept most of the material from B2, changing only the ending measures. I think the overall idea works, but I didn't like the punctuation too much, so I made some slight adjustment so that it would shift to a higher register and with a more dynamic melody. To my taste, this version of the punctuation is sufficiently clear. It lets the music breathe, but it also creates the expectation for a reprise of the opening material. So I settled for this one. With this, section 1 is complete. Moving to section 2, this is the starting draft. As we have seen earlier, I want to even out the length of the phrases here as well. So D will be extended from 7 measures to 8. First of all, I decided to remove the last 2 measures of the draft. Since I liked the remaining material, I only had to decide how to fill in the missing 2 measures. The first option was to have a descending melodic line, like this. The other option was to reprise the melody at a higher register, like this. I eventually decided to keep the second version, making a minor adjustment to the bass line. And so this is the backbone for section 2. Finally, I had to decide how to end the piece. The general idea was to repeat C and D, changing the final measures by introducing a cadence back to A minor, the initial key center of the piece. In this first example, it would also serve as the ending of the piece itself. However, I found this ending to be too abrupt and sudden. So I thought, what if we reprise a revised version of section 1? This would mean keeping a version of D that leads back to A minor, and to add a revised version of the initial period to act as the ending of the piece. After some attempts, this is the version I decided to keep. I think it strikes a good balance between novelty and familiarity. In fact, even though the revised version is quite different in character from the opening of the piece, it still keeps some distinctive features. The first phrase reprises many notes of the original A phrase and is built on an essentially identical bass line. And the second phrase, despite being more dynamic, shows a very similar contour in the higher register as the original phrase B. With the addition of this reprise, I guess the piece can be categorized as a ternary piece, where section 2 is followed by a reprise of section 1. So finally, after several weeks and many hours, here's the finished piece. Well, that's it. It still flowed. I really like some of the ideas, but some other parts are not convincing yet. I haven't decided yet if I will keep it as it is or if I will try to make some further changes. So what can I say? The process has been frustrating, discouraging, depressing, and the result is not as good as I hoped despite the unreasonably long amount of time that it took me. But there was a moment when listening to one version over another, when my brother commented,
"This one is easier to listen to."
I think that's the point of the whole process, to ask oneself, is this version easy enough to listen to? Does it make sense? And to slowly learn what to change and how in order to make the piece work as intended. Anyway, that's it for this episode. If you stayed until now, thanks for watching and see you in the next one.